This is our class person, and in this class person we have 3 fields, which only one of them, underscore person ID, is private. The other 2 are public. Now, the usual way that we used to create a person object and set its value was like this: person p1. Now we have a variable called p1 and equals new person. In this part, we just create an object in heap memory and set the address inside p1, which p1 is in stack memory. Now after that, we set the value to the fields of this object. We use the p1 address point, and then we have the names of the fields inside of the object that in heap memory, and we set the value to the first name and then to the last name. This field we cannot set a value because this field is private, and we do not have access to a private field outside the class person. Here we are in class program. Of course, how can we set a value to a private field? So there is a way, of course. We can write a method, a public method, and using the public method set a value to this private ID. Because the method is public, so it's accessible outside the person class. Here we can access this method, and the method itself can access this private field because the method is part of class person. And then in the last lesson, we'll learn that there is something very interesting called a constructor. A constructor is a very important method that will be invoked only once, only one time, and only in the time of invocation. Here, when we say new person, actually person, here we call this method, we invoke this method. The method, its name is exactly as the name of the class, and we call this method the name of the method and opening and closing round brackets. We call this method, and inside this method is public. Because of that, we can invoke it from here, from class program, even though the method, the constructor, is in class person. And inside the method, we can set a value of a private ID, like so. We invoke this method, and inside the method, we set the value for the private field. But this is happening only at the time of instantiating the person object. Only then, only the first second of the instantiating. We will learn another way to set the values for the person object, and this is not like here, that after the creation of the object we're using the address, the variable p1 to set a value to the fields, but right in the same line of the creation of the person, we open a curly brackets and then setting a value for the fields. No need to specify p2 dot name of the field like here, because here is the body after the creation of the. This is the body of the creation of the object. Inside the body, we know, the program knows that we are referring this object p2, so we don't need to write it p2 dot first name, p2 dot last name. And this line we cannot set, as we see here, the red wavy line. We cannot set its value here because it's private, and we cannot interact with private fields outside the class person. So we cannot set a value here for this. Then we'll learn that. Now I want to teach you that we have another option for constructors. We until now know that this is the way a constructor looks, but actually a constructor also is behaving like a method. It means that it can expect values to be sent in. And this is also a constructor. We see it by the name of the class. The difference between this constructor and this constructor, this constructor does not expect any values, but this constructor expects value, int value. We can invoke, to choose to invoke this constructor and not this constructor. We can choose which constructor to invoke. In this case, we invoke the constructor that does not expect any parameters, any values. But in this case, for P3, we choose to invoke the constructor that expects one parameter, int number. So here in this line, we are not going to invoke this method, this constructor, but this method, this constructor. And in this case, we are sending a value for the person ID. And here, we see that we can have another constructor, a constructor that expects two parameters, which in this case, we are going to invoke this constructor and not this one and not this one. These two constructors will not be invoked, only this one. And as we can understand that there is another constructor. We can build as much as we want constructors. This constructor expects three values, three parameters. So here in P5, we are going to invoke the last constructor that we have that expects three parameters. In this case, only this constructor will be invoked, and these will not be invoked. So we can write any number of constructors we want for any case we want. If we think that maybe the program will try to create a person having only the ID, or not having the ID at all, or having two parameters. So we can build any number of constructors that we think that fits our program.